Okay, welcome. So, this is a new lecture series that we are doing where we're going to be talking about monetary policy and time inconsistency. So, if you wonder what that is, stay tuned. If you are, well, not wondering what it is and you're taking my course, well, then you kind of still have to stay tuned. And if you don't fall into either of those categories, then I don't really know what to tell you. But we're moving forward anyways. So let's talk about time inconsistency. We're going to talk about what it is, why it can be a problem, when it's an issue, which I guess is part of why it can be a problem. Most importantly, we're going to talk about how it affects monetary policy, and we're going to talk about a lot of other stuff too. We're going to discuss an existing, um, albeit relatively early and simple, economic model of monetary policy and time inconsistency and kind of what the issues are that can arise from it. So, this lecture series is going to cover the time inconsistency problem with a couple of nice little examples as well. We're going to have a model of time inconsistency in monetary policy, namely the Barrow and Gordon model. I believe it's from like 1988 or something, 1990, something like that. Whatever it is in fact an interesting model. So we'll be in good shape in understanding time inconsistency in monetary policy after we finish this lecture. We're going to be talking about different types of assumptions regarding expectations within the model. We're going to talk about the difference in equilibria from these two different assumptions within the model. Namely, we're going to be talking about rational and adaptive expectations. And if you don't know what the difference is, really don't worry about it just yet, because I'm going to go through what both of them are in relatively good detail. And that will hopefully answer some questions. Now, if you hear a little bit of knocking around throughout this lecture, it's because I've got two cats that are just up my ass right now. They will not leave me alone. And honestly, I'm kind of cool with it. I kind of like my cats, but at the same time, when they're like knocking stuff around and making it difficult for me to do lectures, um, well, yeah, only cats could speak English or care if they knew what you were trying to tell them. Anyways, enough about that. Next, we are going to talk about rules versus discretion. We're going to talk about what monetary policy under rules would look like. Namely, are they bound by a strict set of rules from which they cannot deviate regardless of the circumstance? We're going to talk about what monetary policy under discretion would look like, where they are basically allowed to do as they see fit in order to stabilize economic conditions, namely stabilize business cycle fluctuations with respect to output in this model, although it can also be done in the context of unemployment and inflation, namely that they would use inflation to try to curb large swings in either output or unemployment. We're going to discuss which one's better, right? Because there's good arguments for either one. There's good arguments for monetary policy that would operate under some relatively strict rules, and there are good arguments for monetary policy under discretion. We're going to talk about why one might be better than the other, or why the other might be better than one. So here's a short little introduction to time inconsistency. Imagine this, right? Imagine you are the dictator of the country of the oil rich Derpistan. And there are a lot of oil companies that are currently in your country, right? Because they come in, they drill, and they, extract the resources. They therefore like employ a lot of people within Derpistan. And well, it's just like a mutually beneficial agreement. Now, as this dictator, you can either expropriate all the capital in the country, right? Basically, just go like to every single oil company and go, hey, guess what? All your stuff that you've got here, it's mine. And if you are a foreign investor, you can get the F out of my country and I'm keeping all your stuff, right? You can do that. That would be expropriating. Or you cannot expropriate and let everybody stay where they are. Why would you want to expropriate? Well, you'd want to expropriate because, well, it would be like politically feasible, not feasible, politically palatable maybe to give everybody in your country that stuff, right? Think of it like as a one-time wealth transfer, right? That looks good for you. But when you do that, it's going to have some consequences tomorrow. So which one do you do? right? If you expropriate, well, you get all the stuff, nationalize the oil industry, and distribute the profits to the people of Turkestan. And as I had just said, this would be good for you because giving people stuff keeps you in political favor with the masses. We like that. Right? Anybody in political power generally wants to stay in political power. Why wouldn't you? That would be kind of dumb, right? So, this is essentially like a one-time transfer. Once you take all the capital away, you'll be able to keep the capital, but eventually it falls apart. You don't really have the trade secrets that these oil companies have for production. It can lead to some relatively inefficient outcomes. You eventually want the oil companies to come back and reinvest, but no one's going to want to. I mean, why would they, right? You're just going to take all their stuff again. So, to continue our little imagination or our thought experiment here, if you don't expropriate, right, you could always just leave everyone there alone, right? You don't take their stuff, you don't expel them, and you can continue to encourage future investment, and you can give a credible signal that you will be encouraging future investment. This is going to keep money and therefore resources flowing into your economy, but you don't get that massive wealth transfer today by getting rid of everyone and just taking all their stuff. So this can become a little bit of a problem because you got short-run gains at long-run costs or long-run gains at short-run costs. Which one do you prefer? Well, it really depends on how patient you are, right? If you're super patient, you're probably going to go long-run gains at short-run costs, right? The short-run cost is I don't get that immediate wealth transfer, but the long-run gain is that you keep this nice inflow of investment into your country, which therefore leads to, well, relatively nice outcomes for your country in the long run. If you're not very patient, on the other hand, you're going to take all their stuff, kick them out, and then tomorrow go, oh God, we don't really have anything. So I would imagine the common sense answer would be to let everybody stay and you don't steal their stuff. Seems fair to me. Well, what does this have to do with time and consistency? If you want your people to come into your country and invest, well, you want them to come in, and regardless of whether or not you want to expropriate their capital, you're going to tell them that you're not going to expropriate. I mean, why would you do this? Well, if you say that you're going to expropriate, right? Like, hey, come into my country, come invest. And once you do, we're going to steal all your stuff and kick you out. People are going to be like, yeah, go pound sand. I'm not doing that. So you obviously have no incentive to tell them what you're really going to do, regardless of what you're actually really going to do, right? Now, if you don't have an incentive to, or if you don't want to actually expropriate and kick everybody out, right, you're going to tell them the same thing that you would if you want to expropriate. You're going to say, we're not going to take your stuff. But there's got to be some credible signal, right? There has to be a decent, credible commitment to not actually kick everybody out. So if you say that you're going to kick everybody out, no one comes in. So you, obviously, if you were planning on expropriating, you would lie and say that you're not going to do it. So you've got every incentive to say that you're not going to kick people out and take their stuff. But in saying that you won't do it, you are either time consistent, in which case you say you're not going to kick them out and take their stuff. And when the time comes to decide whether or not you're actually going to kick them out and take their stuff, you don't kick them out and take their stuff. Or you could be what's known as time inconsistent. You say you're not going to expropriate, and then when the time comes to decide whether or not you want to do it, you take all their stuff and kick them out of the country. So time inconsistency can best be described by saying you have an incentive to announce policy X today to be implemented tomorrow, but when tomorrow rolls around, you've got no reason to follow through on what you said, and you enact policy Y instead, like a jackass. Ultimately, it's a question of whether or not you're going to keep your word in the future. Now, another little example of time inconsistency would be, let's say you are, FEMA, right? And there have been a couple of hurricanes that have hit the coast, and they've been particularly bad. And they've been hitting one area of the country pretty consistently, a couple times a year, every year. And every single time you go in, help people rebuild, they rebuild all their stuff. Hurricane comes around a few months later, wipes it all out, and you got to rebuild it all over again. Now, eventually, right, you're going to get sick and tired of constantly going in there and rebuilding stuff that just gets destroyed anyways. Why would you really like want to keep doing that? It doesn't really make sense, right? So eventually you're like, you know what, we're tired of this. So here's the deal. This hurricane that just hit, we're going to come in and help you rebuild. But we're not going to do it ever again. We're tired of it. We're tired of spending all this money on this to basically allow you to keep making dumb choices. Now, I'm not saying that, constantly moving back there is a dumb choice. I'm just saying from their perspective, right? We're tired of letting you make dumb choices. And then the next hurricane hits. Well, do they want to actually stick to their word? Do they want to not provide assistance? Absolutely not, because that is such a politically terrible idea, right? If FEMA's just like, I think New Orleans was the last city that was hit pretty bad. If they're like, we're tired of helping New Orleans, we don't want to go in there anymore. How do you think that would work out for like anybody? It really wouldn't work out well for New Orleans, but the existing administration would probably be voted out of office like almost immediately, right? First chance they get, gone. And they understand that. So even if they say, we're not going to come help you out next time, they're probably going to help you out next time. Thus, by announcing we're not going to help, but then ultimately having to help anyways, that is an example of time inconsistency, right? Their behavior is not time consistent. Now, time inconsistency shows up like everywhere in economics, especially in game theory, which is just disgusting. I hate game theory. One of the big reasons why I went into macroeconomics is because I didn't like game theory in graduate school. I had to take it my first year in grad school. It didn't work for me. I tried taking a game theory based course my second year, and I didn't like it. Now it's kind of funny that I'm teaching a game theory model, even though I don't really care for it, but at least in monetary economics, the game theory is being applied to a field that I'm interested in, that I care about. Therefore, I can tolerate it a little bit, and it's an interesting and useful model. So yeah, it shows up in monetary econ. Now, we're going to be discussing a model by Barrow and Gordon on time inconsistency, where at least this version of the model runs 2 periods, today and tomorrow. And we've got 2 players. The first player is the monetary authority. And what they do is they set an inflation rate in hopes of trying to affect economic output by variations in the inflation rate. The public responds to the inflation rate, right? And they respond to the inflation rate via changes in real economic activity, output. So the idea is that the monetary authority will want to announce a low rate of inflation in the first period, but will have every incentive to deviate from that announcement where inflation is a bit higher than what they said. The public either reacts to higher inflation by being surprised, going like, oh my God, we were expecting 0 inflation and we got 3% inflation. When that happens, we will discuss within the model how that actually increases output in the short run, right? But it doesn't do so in the long run, thus it lowers the rate of output growth in the future. We can sort of think of this as like a punishment for monetary policy deviating from their announced inflation rate. It's what's known as a trigger strategy. They could also react to higher inflation by having already expected it. And then there's no change to output because, let's say the Fed announces a 0% inflation rate, but everybody goes, they say they want 0% inflation, but we actually know what their preferences are. We know what their quote-unquote objective function is. We'll see what the objective function is in like the next slide or two. We already know what it is. Thus, we know what their incentives are, and we are prepared for those incentives. So if they announce 0 inflation, we know it's actually going to be 3%. And because there's no deviation in inflation from what our expectations are, because we're not allowing the Fed to set our expectations, we have set them ourselves. There's no deviation, thus there is no change in the rate of output. And we end up with higher than desired rates of inflation. So we're going to set the model up here, and we're going to start with the monetary authority's objective function. And it's this guy. It's U equals lambda times YT minus YN minus 1/2 times pi t squared. So what's this YT minus YN? Well, that's just the output gap. right? U here, capital U, is the monetary authority's utility function, right? That's their utility. Y is the observed rate of output, the actual rate of output, right? Yn is the natural rate of output. So yt minus yn is the output gap. So if, say, output is 3%, but the natural rate of output is 2%, the output gap is 1%. Now, if there is some non-zero output gap, right, the amount that output gap is going to affect utility is going to be by an amount lambda times that output gap. So what's lambda? Well, lambda is a positive parameter that describes the monetary authority's preferences of output deviations. A higher lambda means they really, 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 really like it when output's higher, and a lower lambda means they really don't care too much about higher output. Pi t is inflation. So what we can see here, they like output, right? Because lambda times yt minus yn, lambda is positive. Yt minus yn, if yt is larger than yn, right? If the actual rate of output is larger than the natural rate of output, then it is increasing utility by lambda times that output gap. Therefore, positive deviations from the natural rate of output increase utility, but high positive rates of inflation will reduce the monetary authority's utility. Why? Because they don't really like inflation that much. So from this, we can see that lambda times yt minus yn is a positive input to their utility function. So output being higher than the natural rate increases their utility. They get happier. Inflation reduces utility. They don't want high inflation. Now it's quadratic, right? That pi t squared. That means, right, if you were to just draw out a downward opening parabola, because that 1/2 pi t squared is in fact a downward opening parabola. If you were to draw a parabola that's downward opening, right, and you go a little bit further out one way or the other, you'll see that it's not like a linear function. It's not, deviations by the same amount across changes in your input. That deviation is going to be rather large the further out you go. So it reduces their utility by a larger and larger amount, implying that it's a non-linear relationship. This essentially describes the dual mandate that is set for the Federal Reserve by Congress, right? If you ever listen to FOMC announcements, every single time, Chairman Jerome Powell, who is the current chair of the Federal Reserve, will come on and he will be like, consistent with our dual mandate established by Congress to maintain maximum employment and price stability. Well, maximum employment means they want unemployment to be really, really, really low. When you have low unemployment, that means you have high output. And they want price stability to mean that you have prices that aren't deviating a whole lot over time, therefore implying a low rate of inflation. So stable prices, maximum employment. Now, with the Fed, employment is substituted with output, but it's really the same difference, right? It's just a different side of the same coin. Now, the public, right, we've gone through here, equation 2 is the Federal Reserve's, or really, I guess I just need to say the monetary authority's objective function. But that's just one player in the game, right? We've got 2 players total in the game. So the other player is going to be the public. And the public's equation is given by this right here. Yt equals yn plus alpha times pi t, which is inflation, minus expected inflation, the e of pi t, plus this epsilon sub t. So what are these little variables and parameters here? Well, yt and yn are the observed and natural rates of output, respectively, right? So it's the same yt and yn in equation 2. Pi t is the observed rate of inflation. E of pi t is expected inflation. Alpha is how sensitive the public is to deviations of actual from expected inflation. If there's a large deviation in actual and expected inflation, if actual inflation is above expected inflation, it's going to increase output or the rate of output, yt, by alpha times that deviation. We'll go through this in a second, don't worry. Epsilon t is a source of supply-side shocks. Thus, I don't know why it says equation 14. It's supposed to be equation 3. Equation 3 is the Phillips curve for output, not equation 14. So if you're listening to this, please just ignore equation 14. It's supposed to be equation 3. It's the Phillips curve for output, and it represents the trade-off between inflation and output. It is essentially an aggregate supply curve. So from this, right, from equation now 4, although it's the same as equation 3 as you see here, it's just a new slide, so it gave it a new number. If inflation is equal to expected inflation, then inflation minus expected inflation is equal to 0 because they're equal to each other, right? If actual inflation is 2%, expected inflation is 2%, then 2 minus 2 is 0. And output is equal to the natural rate of output, which we'll get to in a second, plus any sort of shocks, which we'll also explain. So output's equal to the natural rate. Any deviation from that natural rate is because of any sort of supply-side shocks. So we're going to learn about this a little bit better via an example. So from this Phillips curve for output, let's say inflation is 2% and expected inflation is 2%. Well, we're going to plug that into the equation. So yt equals yn plus alpha times 2 minus 2 plus epsilon t. Well, that 2 minus 2, right, just reduces to 0. So yt equals yn plus alpha times 0 plus that source of shocks, meaning output is equal to the natural rate plus shocks. So there's nothing moving output from its natural rate besides supply-side shocks. So it's not to say that output is going to be equal to the natural rate all the time. It's not. But the only thing moving output from its natural rate is going to be supply-side shocks. It will not be a monetary policy shock. So from this, right, let's do another example. So let's say now that inflation observed, like actual inflation, is 3% and expected inflation is 2%. Well, we're going to plug that into our equation. I get yt equals yn plus alpha times 3 minus 2 plus shocks. Thus, yt equals yn plus alpha times 1 plus shocks, meaning output is going to be increased above the natural rate yn by alpha times 1%. Now, I'm going to assume that alpha is greater than 0, so any positive value for pi t minus e of pi t, or inflation minus expected inflation, is going to increase output above the natural rate. So from this is where expectations management will really start to come into play here. If the Federal Reserve can keep expectations anchored, as we've discussed in previous lectures, then expected inflation will remain constant at some number and hopefully won't change much, if at all, over time. But if they're not anchored, then expected inflation changes a lot. Now, in general, it's good if expected inflation is relatively low, and it's also good if it's stable. So let's say it's 2%, for example. The public expects inflation at 2%, and it stays at 2% for fairly long periods of time. In this model, what really matters is how different actual inflation is from expected inflation. So while it is, in the real world, important for expected inflation to be low and stable, what we're looking at here, at least in the context of like a 2-period model, is how actual inflation deviates from expected inflation, like just today and tomorrow. Now, we could get into like welfare implications of it, but I don't really want to go that far into the model. So it's really just the way that we need to think of it right now is how does inflation deviate from expected inflation? Are the two equal, or is there a difference between them? So from this equation, right, if expected inflation is 0, then any rate of inflation that is positive will increase output above the natural rate. Now, in the context of this model, this is the result of what's known as a signal extraction problem, which was first discussed by Robert Lucas in 1972. Lucas's idea was that suppliers have to respond to a signal extraction problem when they make decisions regarding production based on observed prices. They have to decide which portion of price changes essentially reflect general changes in nominal prices. What do I mean by that? Well, it's inflation, right? How much of these price changes that they're observing every single day are the result of just all prices, every single price rising by some amount, right? All prices rising by 2%. That would be inflation. But there's variation, right, in how these price indices get computed, because with any price index, you're going to have prices for some goods going up by a lot and some goods not going up by a lot, or prices for some goods not going up at all. Some of them might even fall. So we're looking at like an aggregated amount by which prices are increasing. They're not all going up by the same amount. So if they're not all going up by the same amount, you don't just have all prices going up evenly by the same amount. You have variation. You've got changes in relative prices going on. So when firms have to make these decisions, they have to decide which portion of these price changes are the result of inflation and which are the result of real changes, like changes in relative prices for inputs and outputs. What do I mean by this, right? Well, let's consider we've got two goods. Now, let's see. What two goods can I use? I currently have a Red Bull in my hand, so we will have Red Bull, and we will have microphones, because I'm speaking into a microphone right now. So if the price of Red Bull and the price of this microphone that I'm speaking into go up by 2% each, right? Well, okay, cool. That is the change in inflation. But if, let's say, there's a 2% increase in prices overall, right? So we're observing what we think is a 2% inflation rate, right? If there's a change in relative prices, let's say the price of the Red Bull goes up by 1% and the price of the microphone goes up by 3%, right? Well, all of a sudden now I've got a different situation because there's a change in the relative price between Red Bull and microphones. I have to look at this and go, all right, is the price of the microphone going up because of inflation, or is it going up like because of something else? If it's something else, that will be determining whether or not, if you are a microphone producer, whether or not you want to produce more microphones, right? But if you're just seeing an increase in inflation and you don't think that there's any real change in relative prices for microphones relative to all other goods, well, it's a different situation. You're probably not going to want to make more microphones. So firms have to decide, really, what amount of these price changes is the result of inflation versus just changes in relative prices. Now, from this equation, right, we have the signal extraction problem. Now, Lucas suggested that firms know their industry better than the general economy does. What do I mean by that? Well, if you are in the business of producing microphones, right, and let's say you work for Shure, and you are currently producing the SM7B, which is the microphone I'm speaking into, right, you're probably going to know a lot about what goes into the SM7B, what the costs are that you face in producing the SM7B. And you're probably going to understand variations in not just the input cost, but also the output price of the Shure SM7B than your average Joe on the street, right? If he even knows what a Shure SM7B is, that's probably that's probably really impressive, to be honest with you. You've probably seen them across the board. Chances are all of you have seen a Shure SM7B. You're just not even, you may not actually know what it is. Look it up. You've probably seen it. So because chances are, if you're in that industry, you know the intricacies of that industry better than other people do. If there's a change in inflation, right, you can see it as a change in the relative prices for output, which reflects a better, like real price for its output and thus encourages more production, right? If the price of something goes up, the price of this microphone goes up, you're going to go, oh, cool, arbitrage opportunity, and make more, try to sell them, right? Because you want to sell more at that price. Of course, as you sell more at that price, what happens? Well, the price falls. So this surprise, so to speak, right? If you see this increase in relative prices, or if you see this increase in the price for the SM7B as an increase in relative prices, you are quote unquote surprised, and that could lead to an increase in production. And thus, if you're making more stuff, you're going to need more labor hours. More labor hours implies more employment. This surprise would then feed through the entire economy. So, with the aggregate supply curve given by this, right, it's essentially the Phillips curve, right? So, the Phillips curve is the aggregate supply curve. It describes production as a function of prices, right? That's what supply is. Now, this Phillips curve, however, or this aggregate supply curve, we're going to call it the Phillips curve in this case, it adds the role that expectations play in the economy. So if we have a role for expectations in the Phillips curve, it's thus called the expectations augmented Phillips curve for output. And it describes the relationship between output and inflation as a function of surprises. So if we all expect inflation to be 2%, but we get surprised when it ends up being like, say, 3%, we think it's the result of real changes and not nominal ones. And we produce more until we realize that we've been bamboozled. Once we realize that we've been tricked, we're going to slow output down just a little bit. Now, once we essentially why would output slow down? Why would production slow down a little bit? Well, it's going to slow down because you've already made all this stuff and you realize, right, it's not actually the result of changes in relative prices, but changes rather in nominal prices or inflation. So if there's ultimately this change in inflation, you've made more stuff. Well, you're going to slow down how much of it you're going to make because there's not actually like all this increased demand for it. So it's going to slow down a little bit, right? So from the signal extraction problem, Lucas essentially hypothesized firms know their industry really well, and they can, granted, this is my wording, not his, they can potentially overthink what happens in their industry. Thus, they can look at price changes as coming from one of two places: inflation, right? Typical thing we see every day, or relative price changes, in which case there's like a real change in price, which leads to firms wanting to supply more stuff at a higher price. If they think it's a real price change when really it's inflation, it can be a little bit of an issue. Hence, there's a difficulty in extracting a viable signal from this process. There are two possible causes that can arise from only one metric. This is like an identification problem. Two unknowns in one equation, right? If your boyfriend, girlfriend, partner is mad at you but won't say why, or sorry, if they're mad, not mad at you, if they're just mad, right? They're just upset, but they won't tell you why they're upset. Are they mad at you? Or are they mad at something else? The cause could be any number of things, but there's only one metric you can analyze, right? If your partner can be upset with you, or they can just be upset in general, but all you see is that they're upset and they're not really talking right now, then they could be mad at you. They could be mad about something else and they just don't really want to talk about it right now. But with no additional information, you have a difficulty in extracting the signal from that process, right? You can't identify what the problem is. Basically, there's not enough information to make a viable decision in real time, but you have to make a decision in real time. So if you know, say, your partner very, very, very well, and you see that they're upset, you can look for little things in whether you think they might be upset with you or not. Now, are these going to be absolutely 100% viable, reliable metrics? No. Right? But let's say, when they're upset with you, they tend to cross their arms and ignore everything you say, and they just don't really want to talk to you right now. Versus when they're upset at something else, right? They won't clam up quite so much. They will want to talk with you. Maybe not about what's upsetting them, but they'll talk to you. So if your partner is upset, but they're talking to you, right? You can look at that and go, okay, well, maybe they're not upset with me. Maybe it's something else that pissed them off today. But, right, they may be talking to you because they just don't want deadness in the conversation this time. Therefore, you're like, well, maybe, but maybe not. I don't know. You have to make an educated guess. And that can sometimes work out well for you and sometimes not. It really just sort of depends. So, an example of a signal extraction problem would be that you have, let's say, a slight fever. Is it a cold? Is it the flu? Is it an unspecified virus of undisclosed origin? With no additional information, you've got no idea which one it could be. There's just too many possibilities, right, behind what symptoms you're actually experiencing. You need more information to make a decision because if you've got a little bit of a fever, okay, it could just be a little cold, right? Cold is a different type of virus than the flu, right? The cold is, oh God, dare I say it, coronavirus, and the flu is a different type of virus. But if the only metric you're looking at is a slight fever, it could be one or the other. Now, of course, I'm going to say right now, I am not a medical professional. I'm not an expert in any sort of medical anything. This is purely an example. This is not me providing any sort of medical advice because I am 100% incapable of doing so. If there's symptoms that one of these ailments has that the others don't, right? If you're looking for more symptoms and there's a fever, but there's a different symptom as well, and it's a symptom that, say, the cold has, but the flu doesn't, you might have a better idea about what it is that you have, right? If you think you're a medical expert when you really aren't, you might prescribe medication to treat a cold because, well, you don't really know the medical field all that well, right? So if you prescribe medication to treat a cold, but it's really the flu, or it's something much, much worse that needs much more aggressive treatment, you could essentially really screw people over. This is sort of like what Lucas meant, like kind of, sort of. Very, very, very loose example here, but hopefully it kind of ties some stuff together. Of course, as I said, I'm not a medical expert, and I'm very, very sure that Lucas isn't either. So here's another example. Suppose you're this guy. You don't know who this guy is. Wow, I wish I were so lucky. Now, to this guy, right, he's this finance guy who thinks he knows like everything about everything, and he is staunchly opposed to just even the existence of a Federal Reserve, and he wants like a gold standard and all that stuff. So to him, all inflation, all recessions, all market dips, anything is caused by the Federal Reserve. Yep, he's one of those people, the dreaded Austrian economists, an absolute joke of a school of economic thought. Let's say we have a period of high inflation, right? If we all listen to him, it would be the Fed's fault. It's the Federal Reserve's fault that we have high inflation right now, which we do have high inflation right now. Is it the Fed's fault? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But if we all thought it was the Fed's fault and we thought it was the only thing that's driving it, well, we would immediately begin to unwind the Fed's balance sheet. And we would undo essentially the massive monetary expansion that was done in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if we did that, this would cause a recession. Interest rates would go up. Interest rates go up, output is going to fall, unemployment is going to increase. Things would be markedly worse. Now, this guy does know some stuff, right? But he's not as well versed in economics as he likes to think. And of course, he wants to go on a gold standard, but hilariously, he made a lot of his money on gold. So yeah, there's no conflict of interest at all here whatsoever. But according to this guy, Peter Schiff, high inflation in this case is entirely the Fed's fault, nothing else. So we'd have to drastically cut asset purchases by the Fed and unwind their balance sheet. But let's say, just for a minute, that what's actually driving inflation is maybe Congress passed a spending bill that gave out a lot of stimmies. And this causes an increase in demand, which keeps the economy going. But the problem is the stimmies went out a little too late. They needed to go out and say like November or December of 2020. Honestly, they needed to go out even earlier than that. But they went out by like March 2021. Things were already getting better, right? The vaccine had already rolled out. People had already started taking it. We were starting to return to what would sort of be like considered normal. Maybe not quite pre-pandemic normal, but some approach towards normality. So if things are already starting to improve, but then we're throwing more money at it, the money's too late, then demand could shift up a bit too much, supply can't keep up, and you have high inflation. And if at the same time supply can't keep up and people don't necessarily want to return to work just yet for a plethora of possible reasons, you're going to have a real problem, right? Essentially, high demand, low supply. That's not going to be a good thing, right? What we would have wanted is this right here. So if we were to graph inflation on the vertical axis, output on the horizontal axis, right? And we have an aggregate supply curve here. Now, it's not linear, meaning it's flat in some areas and it's steep in other areas. Why is it like this? Well, essentially, as we begin to produce more stuff, right? We start at a very low level of output and we start to produce a little bit more. Well, we're not pushing up against any sort of like capacity constraints. But as we make more and more stuff, eventually you hit capacity constraints. If you are working 2 hours a week, right? And then you go to work, say, 3 hours a week. Is there any capacity constraint? Probably not, right? Because you've got, how many hours out of a week and you're working 3 of them? Okay, not a big deal, right? But let's say all of a sudden you're working 70 or 80 hours a week. And then you work, say you're initially working 80 hours a week, right? And then you work that 81st hour. Are you getting a little bit closer to your capacity constraint for that week? Probably, because you can't spend all your time working. You can spend a lot of it working, yes, but you can't spend all of it because you have other obligations in your life. You've got, a house to maintain. If you're like me, you've got 4 cats to feed and keep alive. You've got other stuff. You have to sleep, right? You have to eat. You can't spend all your time working. So eventually you start to hit that capacity constraint and you just can't really make much more. So if you can't make much more, but people want you to make more stuff, what do? You're like, screw it, you got to give me more money, man. I need more pay for this. Well, it's the same kind of thing with this case here, right? Only it's not just labor, but we can also think of it in terms of capital. If you are, say, working a grill, right, in a restaurant, and you can grill, say, 10 steaks at a time. Cool. As long as you are able to grill 10 steaks at a time, you're good. But if, say, demand is such that you're requested to grill 12 steaks at a time, can't really do that, right? So what are you going to do? Well, you have to ration out what your current capacity is. If that capacity constraint's not being hit, if it's not binding, well, you don't have to charge any more money. But as soon as it's binding, you're like, okay, look, I got to charge more money because I can't please all of you guys. I can only do it for some. So I'm only going to make like 10 steaks at a time, and I'm going to raise my price such that the quantity of steaks demanded is equal to the amount that I can, in fact, supply. So the idea here would be to have a shift in aggregate demand from these stimmies that shifted us along a flatter region of the aggregate supply curve. Therefore, we increase output way more than we increase inflation, right? Because if output is generally pretty low, because there's not a lot of people working, there's not a lot of stuff being made, and you think that it's the result of demand side issues, then increasing demand, well, it can increase output at not too high of a cost of inflation. But we're over here, right? So we shift aggregate demand out, but it's along a much steeper part of the aggregate supply curve. Then we get very little increase in production, but we get a massive increase, in inflation. So this is what the government wanted, and this is what they got, because the stimulus checks went out a little too late. They went out after things had started improving, not before, or I mean, it would have even been bad during, but at least, would have been better than after things started improving, and this is the result of what happens. So someone definitely did screw up, but it wasn't entirely the Federal Reserve. Honestly, I don't think the Federal Reserve screwed up at all. But if we'd listened to Peter Schiff, then we would think it was the Fed, and it wouldn't actually start the problem where it started, or it wouldn't stop the problem where it started, which was with Congress, not the Federal Reserve. Now, I could go for a long time on how Congress screwed up here, but that's not the purpose of this lecture. If you were to just look at inflation and think that it's always from the Federal Reserve and not from any other causes, then you're poorly identifying the source of the problem. And you go after the wrong thing, hence signal extraction problem. Okay, back to the Phillips curve, or the expectations augmented Phillips curve for output. We talked about deviations in actual from expected inflation, but let's talk about what this alpha term is. What is the role that alpha plays? Well, it tells us how sensitive supply is to deviations in inflation from expectations. How sensitive is the economy to price surprises? Now, alpha has to be larger than 0, so it's non-zero, it's non-negative, it's positive, in order for supply to have an upward sloping, slope. We need upward sloping aggregate supply because why? Supply is upward sloping. The values for alpha tell us something that's really cool, though. It tells us how upward sloping aggregate supply is. Alpha is less than 1, right? Output's not very responsive to changes in inflation. So if it's between 0 and 1, then if there is some deviation in actual inflation from expected inflation, then output's not going to respond very much. If alpha is equal to 1, then it increases by exactly the same amount that inflation deviates from expectations. If inflation deviates from expected inflation by 1%, output increases by 1%. If alpha is larger than 1, output increases by more than what the unit change was in inflation. So from this, if alpha is small, aggregate supply is shallow. Not a very steep slope. Output's less responsive than inflation to shocks. If alpha is 1, aggregate supply has got a slope of 1, which means if inflation deviates from expectations by 1%, output responds by exactly 1%. 1-to-1 relationship. This is what it would look like. If we graphed output on the vertical axis and inflation on the horizontal, you can see if alpha is equal to 1, then it just has a slope of 1. There's a 1 unit increase in inflation. There's going to be a 1 unit increase in output. If alpha is small, if alpha is less than 1, but it's still greater than 0, because it has to be greater than 0. If alpha is small, then it'll increase, but not by a whole lot, right? Say inflation increases by 2% above expectations, alpha say equal to 1/2, then output would increase by only 1%, right? So for every 2 percentage points that inflation increases above expectations, output increases by only 1 percentage point. Conversely, if alpha is larger than 1, say alpha is equal to 2, then for every 1 percentage point increase in inflation, you will have a 2 percentage point increase in the rate of actual output. So this tells us how alpha relates inflation deviations or inflation surprises to output. Okay, so we've covered that stuff. Let's talk about the natural rate of output. What is that? Well, it's that y sub n, and it represents the rate of output that we would have if there were no sources of any supply shocks, right? Or inflation deviations as well. So it's like the natural rate of unemployment, because it's just like a steady state rate of output the economy operates at when everything is normal. Think of it as like a long run growth rate, right? If output just is naturally growing at a long run rate of 3%, right? If you were to just take 2 points in time over the last 50 years, just draw a line between them, right? That's like 3%, and that means the long run rate of growth and output's like 3%. So it's just kind of like a steady state, super smooth rate of output growth. Now, this rate is assumed to be constant over time. That doesn't mean it's not growing. It just means that it's growing at a constant rate. So if it's growing at, say, 3% every year, then output next year is going to be 3% larger than what it was this year. Year after that, 3% larger than what it was next year, so on and so forth. So if yn is equal to 3%, the natural rate of output is 3%. Now let's say actual inflation equals expected inflation. So there's no deviation in inflation from expectations. Output is equal to 3%, or the rate of output, sorry. The natural rate of output's 3%. Then output is equal to 3% plus shocks. So finally, the last term we got to talk about, that epsilon t. This is a source of supply side shocks. If it's larger than 0, it increases output. It's a positive supply shock. If it's less than 0, it decreases output. Negative supply shock. If it's equal to 0, there's no change in output. No shock whatsoever. We assume on average that it is equal to 0. So every period, in all likelihood, it is going to be equal to 0. Now, it doesn't mean it's always going to be equal to 0. It just means that on average, it's 0. So we won't be relying on shocks to affect the rate of output at any point in time. It's not like, oh, well, I think that there's going to be a positive supply shock tomorrow. No, you would expect that tomorrow there is going to be no supply shock whatsoever. Essentially, it's got a normal distribution. So it's a bell curve, right, where the mean, right, the peak of that bell curve is 0, and it's got a variance of sigma squared. So every period you can expect it to be 0. Thus, the expectation of that shock is 0. Now, that's going to wrap up this talk, right? This talk's going pretty long, actually. It's one of the longer talks I've made. So next time, we're going to talk about the monetary authority's utility function, what it means in the model, how the monetary authority actually decides what the optimal inflation rate is, why it would be what it is, what that means for the economy as a whole, etc. We're going to talk about when the central bank chooses an inflation rate, they may not want to announce the inflation rate they actually chose. They may want to announce an inflation rate that's different, like perhaps lower. Now, it could increase output above the natural rate for a short period of time, which leads to the public reacting a certain way. When they do that, it increases output now, but it'll drop a little bit later. It's some game theory, different strategies, what's known as a trigger strategy. If it's done at all, like any sort of punishment, it's a grim trigger if they punish forever. And yeah, all that fun stuff. But anyways, to wrap up a 53-minute video, I'm going to wrap up the 53-minute video now. And stay on the lookout. There's going to be another talk coming soon that will wrap up the remainder of this model. At least one more talk, possibly 2 talks, but we will see. So thank you for watching, and you will see more videos coming soon.